Hello friends, in the earlier discussion which we had on American New Wave films, we talked about the kind of origin of the American New Wave cinema. We also talked about some of the aspects which were concerned with the American New Wave and how it also got influenced from the similar kind of developments which had happened in the other countries of the world, whether the precursor in the framework of the Italian New Wave or the Italian Neorealism or the French New Wave cinema. And we find that across the world how Italian Neorealism or the French New Wave, they were affecting the cinemas of the world. And at the same time we also find that developments, they were not only happening in the American cinema, but at the same time whether in the framework of the cinema novo, if we see that how in Brazil these kind of developments came in the context of the Indian cinema, where we find that developments in the Hindi film industry could also be seen. So it was a period when there was a lot of thrust that how some kind of independent filmmaking should be done, and the American filmmakers, they wanted that they should be away from the kind of support or the kind of changes which were to be seen at that point of time. And during this particular period, we see that the American filmmakers, in that sense, they wanted that they should be free from the shackles of the studio system as well. And we find that during this particular period when these filmmakers, they were making these films, their focus was on the auteur, that how when you talk about the filmmakers, we see that how in the context of that particular book, for example, the author of that particular book is the one who is the deciding factor. And in the context of the films, the auteur or the author of that particular film is an important concern. And when the auteur or the film director, he is the one who decides everything about that particular film. He is the author of that particular film. And we find that we talked about Leonard Rogozin, that how he was a powerful influence in that sense, and he made a film called On Bovary, which was a powerful depiction of alcoholism and despair, and won the grand prize for the documentary at 1956 Venice Film Festival, which was the British award for best documentary, and was nominated for an Oscar. His film Pull My Daisy had a major influence on other realist filmmakers, including John Cassavetes, who described Rogozin as greatest documentary filmmaker of all time. So we find that these kinds of films which were made during this particular period, and how these filmmakers, their focus was on realism, and all these filmmakers, they wanted to deal with reality in a meaningful and purposeful manner. And how the films which were made by Rogozin, they are considered to be the greatest documentary films of their time, and he is also considered as the greatest documentary filmmaker of all time as well. So in that particular context, when we find that how films which were dealing with the day-to-day reality of those times, and how these films, they were trying to convey the socio-economic political concerns of that particular period as well. Then we also see Robert Frank, who spent nearly 2 years between 1955 and 1957 traveling across America and taking the photographs of the real people he encountered along the way. And in that sense, Americans, which was published in 1958, was a landmark in photography. And soon after, Frank had moved away from photography to concentrate on filmmaking. So we find that people, those who had that kind of a vision, that they shifted from one field of art to another. One of them was Robert Frank, who was more into photography, and who later shifted to filmmaking as well. And when you talk about the films which were made by him, Pull My Daisy in 1959, which was directed along with Alfred Leslie. And we find that this particular film was set in a New York apartment, and it tells the story of a railway brakeman whose wife invites a bishop over for dinner. And we find that it was only for brakeman's bohemian friends to crash party with inevitable comic results. So we find that these kinds of filmmakers, they had their own particular kind of vision, and when they were making these kinds of films which were trying to bring about a new kind of a reality. And we also see that these kinds of filmmakers, how they combined the poignancy of various kinds of films like Little Fugitive, authenticity of On Bavaria and Jazzy, vivacity of Pull My Daisy, or how this kind of a thing was being done. And in that context, we find that George Cassavetes' Shadows, which was released in 1959, was the emblematic cornerstone of the first American New Wave film. And when you talk about the filmmakers like John Cassavetes, those who were instrumental in the context of the American New Wave cinema and the kind of contribution which they made when they made their own films like Shadows, which was made by Cassavetes. And when these kinds of films, they were being shot with the handheld cameras, we find that whether they were being shot in New York for over 2 years with a cast which was made up mostly of the actors from Cassavetes' own method acting workshops, and Shadows was innovating in that sense and a world away from mainstream cinema of its times. And much of the dialogue was improvised as Cassavetes grasped for a new form to express new ideas. So we find that they were not only using new techniques with regard to the handheld cameras, which will be useful in terms of the showing the reality of the crowded areas, and it would have been easier in that sense to shoot there. And then we also see the way characterization which was also being done, where we find that a lot of focus was on the character rather than the story as well, and never judging the characters' actions but observing them from outside. So these kinds of things, they were definitely being done, and how they also made or brought about a lot of changes as well. And when you talk about the narrative, it was concerning as an interracial romance was audacious in its own right as well, because the story was also in that sense important, that the way it was trying to project the kind of reality. And we find that this particular film was also recognized as a major accomplishment by the American critics, who saw it as a vanguard of a new American cinematic revolution, which was in a way equivalent to what was happening in France. And we find that the kind of success which it brought about, it also led to the attention of the Paramount Studios, who hired Cassavetes to direct 2 films, Too Late Blues and A Child Is Waiting, and both of them, they failed to impress either critics or the public as well. And we find that Cassavetes returned to acting, appearing in such films as Don Siegel's Killers, Dirty Dozen in 1967, and Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby in 1968. So we find that some kind of intervention was made by certain filmmakers, and many times they were not all that successful after their first success, and such was the case with Cassavetes as well. And thereafter, how he shifted to acting, and he appeared in other films as well. So when you talk about these kinds of filmmakers, we find that, as we talked about Cassavetes, that he also acted in other filmmakers' films. For example, Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby in 1968. And apart from that, he had also shifted to other films like Dirty Dozen in 1967, and before that he also worked in The Killers in 1964 as well. So when you talk about these kinds of filmmakers, those who were ready to experiment, those who were ready to not only make that kind of a cinema, but at the same time when they were getting that opportunity, then they also acted in the films as well. And they were also very aware that when they will work in other films, they will be able to generate some kind of a money, and with that money they could also make their own films. And so this kind of a passion which all these filmmakers had for the independent filmmaking, as Cassavetes had, and he made a film called Faces in 1968, and which was away from the interference of the studios, and we find the films portrayed of a disintegrating middle class marriage is an uncompromising study of the despair and emptiness at the heart of the American dream. And refining his trademark improvisational cinema verite style, Cassavetes' raw and sometimes uncomfortable film confirmed the promise of shadows as well. So we find that his films, they were being also nominated for the Academy Awards, and they were also box office successes as well. And in the later times, we find that how Cassavetes would continue his examination of the alienation of the American life in such films as Woman Under Influence and On Streams, becoming the archetype of uncompromising independent director and hero and mentor to new Hollywood generations as well. So we find that such kind of filmmakers, they also influenced the other filmmakers as well, those who came later than them, and they also borrowed something from them, and then they created their own style. In that sense, we find that Shirley Clarke, who began by filming dance performances in mid-1950s, before turning her attention to abstract studies of architecture in Bridges Go Round, an Academy Award nominee Skyscraper in 1960. So we find that apart from Cassavetes, other filmmakers, as we talk about Shirley Clarke, and how she was also very instrumental in that sense, that how she also made films with regard to the dance performances in the mid-1950s. And thereafter, we also find that her abstract studies of architecture in Bridges Go Round and Academy Award nominee Skyscraper, they were also very, very relevant in 1960s when these kinds of films, 50s and 60s, we find that these kinds of films when they were being made. And we also find that some kind of a wider public attention also occurred to her with connection in 1961 about a group of jazz musicians and drug addicts waiting for their fix. Like Cassavetes' Shadows, it was a landmark of its time, heralding an unflinching new cinematic realism focusing on the pressing social issues of those times. So all these filmmakers with their own ideas, they were trying to bring about a kind of a change in the American film industry with their own kinds of ideas. And we also find that some of the films which were made in the later times as well, whether they were dealing with the street gangs or for that matter some kind of a documentary portrait of a black homosexual prostitute, as it was being done in the portrait of Jason in 1967. So we find that these kinds of films, they were groundbreaking in that context, and they also took risk in both the content as well as the form, and the foregrounding filmmaking process and implicating the viewer in events which were being portrayed. So we find that this kind of a cinema, which was the new American cinema, this kind of a group which was there, and as you can see on the screen as well, on September 28, 1960, we find that 23 independent filmmakers led by writer John S. Mikas and including Clarke and Stan Brakhage, they issued the first statement of the new American cinema group in Film Culture magazine, in which they committed themselves to a cinema, and this particular kind of a cinema was of personal expression, which was in opposition to the product film, and rejecting the interference of producers, distributors, investors, while taking a stand against the censorship and present distribution exhibition policies. So we find that all these filmmakers, they were talking about the personal expression as an important concern when they were talking about the new wave cinema, and it was also in opposition to the product film, that film should not be seen in some sort of as a product for the consumers, and it in a way rejected that how the producers, distributors and the investors, or the people, those who were largely concerned with the money aspect which was related to cinema, and they also took in a way some kind of a stand against the kind of censorship which was existing, that they wanted that such kind of a censorship which is there, it should not be it should not be exercised in the manner in which it was being exercised, and also the kind of contemporary distribution exhibition policies which were there, they were also being rejected in that sense. So we find that they were talking in the framework of the kind of grants which should be given to them, any kind of festivals which should be organized, and cooperative distribution centers as well. And in 1962 we find that the filmmakers cooperatives, it was being formed, and putting many of these aspirations into the practice, and Jonas Mekas made the Guns of Trees in 1960. So we find that they were not only concerned with regard to the films which were being made by them in terms of bringing about change in terms of filmmaking, but at the same time they were also concerned with the distribution network as well. And for that, as I told you, that filmmakers cooperative was also being formed, so that the distribution channels they could also be reformed according to their own conceptions and ideas. And Mekas refers to a new generation of filmmakers in other countries also, Free Cinema in England, Nouvelle Vague in France, Young Movements in Poland, Italy and Russia, with whom he aligns new American cinema. So we find that during this time the New York School may not have been as cohesive and defined as a group as some of the other new wave movements, but it is also true to say that they displayed many of the same ambitions and their characteristics as well, and they made up of a loose collection of avant-garde, theoretical and documentary filmmakers, and they shared an antipathy towards the mainstream cinema and courage to pursue their own vision. So the mainstream cinema which was only dealing with some kind of entertainment, which was not many times concerned with the day-to-day issues, it was being rejected by them, and they said that their concern was with the art, and they were there for the art but not at the expense of life. We don't want false, as Mekas said, polished, sleek films. We prefer them rough, unpolished but alive. We don't want rosy films, we want them color of blood. Example, they said, would have profound influence on several generations of American filmmakers. So these filmmakers, they also were talking in that kind of a language, that they were not going for the slick films which had a very high production value, because they wanted the rough, unpolished films which are more alive in nature. And we find that in the later times we have this direct cinema which was coinciding with the emergence of the New York New Wave, and the Cinema Verite in France, American Canadian direct cinema group of filmmakers. They led a revolutionary breakthrough in documentary film practices beginning in the late 1950s. So this kind of a direct cinema was also very, very important in that particular sense, because it was first coined to describe a form of fly on the wall filmmaking that sought to directly capture reality and represent it truthfully without taking recourse to professional lighting, interviews and authoritative voiceover. And this was possible in that sense by the development of the light, portable cameras, allowing the filmmakers and a more intimate relationship with their subjects as well. And the development of the new sound recording equipment was another key innovation, enabling for the first time real-time sync recording of sound and picture. So we find that how technology definitely was important, and when these kinds of developments in the technology came, they were seen to be some kind of a key innovation as well. And real-time syncing and recording of sound and picture also became possible because of that. And we also find that how the direct cinema, which was there in the United States when Robert Drew, a journalist and editor with Life magazine, sought a way to apply photojournalistic methods to moving films that could be shown on television. So we find that how the journalists also they also in a way tried to apply some kind of methods which were there in their own professional life to the films as well, and they could also be shown on the television as well. And in that sense we find that impressed by a film about a traveling tent theater in Midwest called Toby and Tall Corn, that made him feel like he was really there, and he contacted its maker Richard Libok with a proposal to collaborate. And when he agreed, they together formed a group of other skilled and like-minded filmmakers and formed the Drew Associates. So when they invested money in that, and how during that time the invention of the light camera as well that could shoot handheld without a tripod. So this kind of a lighter camera in that sense allowed the operator more mobility and intimacy in terms of filmmaking. So the people, those who are associated with this kind of a cinema, they wanted to showcase how the things they really were, and they were not concerned with how they might appear to be. And the success of such an approach relied on an agreement between the subject and the filmmaker that the subject would act as if camera was not there. So that was the kind of concern which was being shown in these films. And we also find that the kind of changes which were coming at this point of time, and the films which were being made, many times they were raw, but their revealing style, it helped define and raise the profile of the direct cinema when it was broadcast on television. So these kinds of changes which came during this time, and which were focusing on the raw aspect of the film, and which was in a way trying to convey the new kind of a medium, that way was also very, very important during that time. And we find that over a period of time, the people, those who were associated with this kind of filmmaking and those who were sharing this kind of an approach, they moved on to other subject matter and inventing the modern rock documentary with films which were made during this time. And some of them like Salesman in 1969. And we also see that these kinds of changes which came in 1960s and early 70s, and a new generation of young filmmakers, they came to prominence in the American cinema, and their work was thematically complex, formally innovative, morally ambiguous, anti-establishment, and rich in mythic resonance. And they were speaking for a generation which was disillusioned by the Vietnam War, which was disenchanted by the ruling elite and less willing to conform than their parents. So we find that all of them, they were in a way trying to bring about the kind of changes in that particular context, and the kind of films which were being made, they were comparatively innovative in nature, and they were not trying to conform to the rules of the establishment, and rather they were ready to go beyond those kinds of rules. And they were also in a way influenced with the kind of socio-political reality of their own times, where they were disillusioned by the Vietnam War, and they were not ready to conform as their parents were in the earlier generation. and we find that New Hollywood, they were dubbed as New Hollywood by the press, and their films were mostly financed by major studios. But they introduced subject matter and a new stylistic approach that set them apart from the studio transition. And they were influenced by the revolutionary new waves of cinema coming out of Europe. They reworked and reimagined some of the Hollywood's classic genres such as crime films, war films, and the westerns, and by doing so presented a more critical view of America, past and present. And when we see that these brilliant new generation of the actors and actresses, they often trained in the acting schools in New York, they brought a new level of realism and intensity to the screen as well. And even while they were behind the scenes in terms of whether they were the writers or cinematographers, editors, composers, and other creative figures, they changed way the American movies looked and sounded, because they brought some kind of a new ideas in terms of the filmmaking processes, whether they were in front of the camera, whether they were at the back of the camera, in the different departments of the filmmaking. But they were ready to experiment, they were ready to bring about that kind of a change which was needed by them, which was also, in a way, we find that they were not only trying to bring this kind of a change from within, but at the same time from without as well, where we find that movements from other countries as well in the field of cinema, they also influenced them. And so they wanted to have their own point of view, and these filmmakers, they wanted to present that kind of a point of view to others, and they were in a way trying to deviate from the classical narratives of the earlier times, and their stylistics and narratives were comparatively different from the earlier times. And when we find that how this kind of a cinema was an important change in that particular context, and when we tend to see the cinema of the America in the context of the new wave cinema, and when we tend to compare it with the cinema of the other countries, we find that it was a great moment for the filmmaking, in that sense that all these kinds of changes, they were coming across the world. So thank you very much.